The fog had not lifted for 3 days over the hills of McCreary County when the stranger arrived. His boots were caked in red clay, his satchel heavy with glass plates, and his eyes too curious for a place that had long forgotten visitors. Locals at the only gas pump warned him about the road beyond the creek, the one that led up toward the Hartley place, but curiosity, as it always does, whispered louder than fear. They said the Hartleys kept to themselves, that their bloodline had twisted inward for generations, and that no one in town had seen a Hartley child past the age of 20 in over a decade. Still, the photographer smiled, said he only wanted a picture, and drove on. The farmhouse emerged from the fog like a scar, sagging wood, windows black as open mouths, the smell of rot and rain. He found them standing in the yard as if they'd been waiting, 6 figures with the same colorless hair and eyes that never blinked in unison. Their skin carried a pallor that reminded him of candle wax, and when they finally agreed to sit for the photograph, he felt a weight in the air, a hush that swallowed even the sound of his shutter. It was only later, in the dim red light of his darkroom, that the truth began to take shape, something behind them, faint at first, like a smudge of shadow growing sharper with each passing second. And as the image bled into focus, the photographer realized that the Hartley family had not been alone when he took their picture. In the year 1941, the war had already stretched across oceans, yet in the quiet corners of rural Tennessee, time seemed untouched. The mountains kept their secrets, the roads bent like whispers, and the people who lived there seldom cared for the noise of the outside world. That was where a man named Thomas Keene came driving through one cold morning, his old Chevy rattling against the stones of a narrow, unmarked road. He wasn't a journalist or a lawman, just a traveling photographer, one of those who believed that a single photograph could capture the truth of a dying America. His eyes searched for forgotten faces, places where history still breathed through decay, and it was that search that drew him to the hollow where the Hartley family lived. The locals at a gas station near the county line tried to warn him. They said the hollow wasn't on any map for a reason. One of the older men sitting by the pump spat into the dirt and muttered that people up there didn't take kindly to strangers, especially not since the Hartleys stopped coming down to town. Thomas had smiled politely, pretending not to notice the way they avoided meeting his gaze. He'd heard similar warnings before, old mountain superstitions about cursed families and places where the bloodline ran too deep into itself. It was all just the kind of folklore that made his photographs worth something. By noon, the fog began to thicken around the hills, swallowing the treetops and muting every sound except the crunch of gravel beneath his tires. His camera and tripod clinked quietly in the passenger seat. A crow followed his car for miles, cawing at intervals as though mocking him for going where others would not. He had read somewhere that Tennessee held some of the oldest, most isolated families in the country, people untouched by modernity, their stories buried beneath layers of silence and shame. That fascinated him more than anything. To capture such faces, he thought, would mean capturing something older than time itself. But as he neared the top of the ridge, the air grew heavy, and the scent of decay began to seep through the vents. He couldn't tell if it came from the forest or from something deeper, something unseen. The road finally ended before a rotting wooden gate tied shut with barbed wire. Beyond it, through the mist, he saw a shape, a crooked house slouching against the earth, its roof bent and windows dark. He shut off the engine and sat for a long moment, the silence pressing against him like a warning. Then he reached for his camera case and stepped out, unaware that the click of his shutter would soon capture something that was never meant to be seen. The Hartley homestead revealed itself like something half-remembered from a fever dream. The moment Thomas stepped through the broken gate, the sound of the world seemed to vanish. No birds sang, no wind stirred the trees, and even his own footsteps felt muffled by the damp earth. The fog hung low, twisting between the branches like something alive, and in that haze, the house appeared less like a dwelling and more like a wound in the landscape. Its paint had long surrendered to rot, the boards swollen and warped, the roof caving inward as if the structure itself were tired of standing. Weeds crept up the porch steps, and the windows, 4 on the front, 2 cracked, one missing entirely, stared back at him with an expression that felt almost human. He had seen poverty before, the quiet decay of forgotten lives, but this place carried something else entirely. It didn't just look abandoned, it looked *watched. He hesitated before climbing the steps, his camera heavy in his hands. The wood groaned beneath him, the sound sharp against the silence. For a long moment, he thought the place empty, until a faint movement caught his eye, a curtain fluttering behind one of the upper windows, though there was no wind to move it. His pulse quickened. Someone was inside. He called out, his voice cracking the quiet like a whip, introducing himself as a photographer documenting the Hill families. No reply came, only the echo of his words swallowed by the mist. He called again, louder this time, and after several breaths of stillness, the front door creaked open an inch, then two, until a narrow slice of darkness peered out at him. A woman's face appeared in the gap, pale as milk and motionless as a portrait. Her eyes were so light they almost blended with the whites, and her expression carried no trace of curiosity, only caution, perhaps even fear. She didn't speak, just watched him as if measuring whether he was real. Thomas offered a faint smile, lifting his camera to show he meant no harm. After a long, uneasy pause, the door opened fully, and she stepped aside to reveal the others. There were 5 of them in total, 2 men, 3 women, standing in a row like an audience waiting for a cue. Each bore the same uncanny features, the same pallid complexion, the same near-colorless eyes, the same slack-jawed stillness. Thomas tried to speak again, but the words caught in his throat. He had found the Hartleys, or what was left of them, and as they stared back at him from that collapsing porch, he couldn't shake the feeling that something in their gaze recognized him, as though they'd been expecting his arrival all along. The Hartleys did not speak much, and when they did, their voices carried a strange, uneven rhythm, like words spoken through sleep. Thomas tried to explain his purpose as gently as he could, telling them he was traveling across the Appalachian backcountry capturing portraits of families who had lived there for generations. His words seemed to hang in the air before reaching them, as though the house itself was listening. The eldest of the group, a man whose face looked carved from ash wood, finally nodded. His eyes were gray and glassy, and when he turned toward the others, they followed him without hesitation, shuffling into position on the porch. There was no sign of curiosity, no attempt to tidy themselves or smile. They simply stood there, waiting. It was as if the act of being seen had been decided for them, not by them. Thomas set up his tripod in the yard, his boots sinking into the soft mud as he adjusted the focus. The family barely moved, their blank expressions unbroken by the chill that hung in the air. He noticed how eerily alike they were, the same narrow faces, the same thin lips, and the same light hair that looked almost translucent beneath the grey sky. The resemblance was so precise it unsettled him, as though he were photographing reflections rather than people. One of the younger girls, perhaps 15, clutched a small doll made of rags and twine. Its head was missing, but her fingers tightened around it with something like devotion. Another woman, older, kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting someone to emerge. Thomas tried to break the tension with idle conversation, asking how long the family had lived there. He leaned closer, the dim red light painting the edges of his face. The figure stood half in shadow, half in the open, as if it had been caught mid-step. The shape of its head was slightly bent, its shoulders slumped, and one long arm stretched forward, resting on the eldest daughter's shoulder. Thomas blinked hard, convinced he was seeing the chemical residue of a previous photograph bleeding through. He checked the negative again, then the surrounding plates, none bore such a mark. The more he studied it, the more distinct it became, the faint outline of a man whose face was blurred beyond recognition, and yet whose presence dominated the entire image. Something about the figure's placement struck him wrong. The light didn't match. The fog that blanketed the family's feet stopped short around the figure, as though it existed outside the scene altogether. His breath clouded the glass as he stared, unable to pull his eyes away. It wasn't merely the sight of it that disturbed him, but the sensation that the photograph was watching back. The man's hand, faint but unmistakable, seemed to press harder against the girl's shoulder the longer Thomas looked. For a moment, he imagined the figure shifting, the grain of the image trembling like something alive beneath the emulsion. He stepped back, nearly stumbling over a chair, and forced himself to look away. He told himself it was nothing more than a flaw, a chemical accident, a double exposure, a phantom of light and timing. Still, as he drained the solution and hung the plate to dry, he couldn't shake the certainty that he had captured something that hadn't been there when he pressed the shutter. The photograph, gleaming faintly under the red light, seemed to breathe with its own quiet rhythm, and from the shadowed corner of the room came a faint sound, like the slow creak of a floorboard beneath an unseen step. When the image finally dried and Thomas could see it in full, a cold weight settled in his stomach. Under the dim bulb that hung from the ceiling, the photograph revealed more than just the family and the strange figure behind them. It carried a texture, a mood, that seemed to reach out from the paper itself. The Hartleys stood pale and motionless as before, but now their expressions looked changed, almost frightened, as though the presence behind them had only become visible after the shutter clicked. The blurred man's outline had grown clearer than before, his fingers, long and bony, pressed deeper into the girl's shoulder, and the look on her face, wide eyes, parted lips, suggested she had felt that touch. Thomas stepped back, heart pounding, trying to reason with himself. He examined the plate again, convinced the figure was an illusion, a shadow of something caught in the fog. But there was no denying it, the lines of the figure were too deliberate, too human. He decided to show the photograph to Mr. Dyer, the man who ran the general store and knew everyone in town. Dyer squinted at it under the light, his lips parting slightly as his eyes fixed on the shadowed man. "That's old Ezra Hartley," he murmured, almost to himself. "Ain't possible, though. Ezra's been dead near 8 years. Thomas froze, the words sinking in before he could respond. Dyer explained in a low, uneasy voice that Ezra had been the head of the Hartley clan, a violent man by all accounts, one whose cruelty had kept his family isolated long before his supposed death. Some said he'd gone mad after the mines closed, others whispered that he'd never really died, only vanished into the woods. Either way, the Hartleys had never spoken of him again. The air in the store grew tense as Dyer studied the image once more, his eyes flicking from the ghostly hand to the terrified faces of the living. "You oughta burn that," he muttered finally, sliding the photo back across the counter. Thomas tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked halfway through. He tucked the photograph into his satchel and left, feeling the eyes of the few customers follow him to the door. The wind outside had picked up, carrying the sharp scent of rain, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw someone standing beside his car, a figure watching from the edge of the street. When he blinked, it was gone. Still, the unease clung to him all the way back to his room, where he placed the photograph face down on the table. Yet even with its image hidden, he could still feel it there, pulsing faintly in the dark like something alive. The name Ezra Hartley lingered in Thomas's mind long after he left the general store. It followed him through the rain-slick streets, echoing in every drop that hit the pavement. Back in his room, he laid the photograph on the table, this time beneath the lamplight, determined to prove to himself that what he'd seen was a trick of exposure. Yet no matter how he turned it, how closely he examined the grain, the face remained a shadowy presence that looked unmistakably human. And now, with Dyer's words ringing in his ears, it wasn't just any man. It was someone who should have been long dead. Ezra Hartley. The thought made his stomach twist. He had seen enough death in his travels to know its silence, but the idea of capturing it on film, of freezing it beside the living, was something far different. He needed to be sure. That night, he found his way to the town library, a creaking 2-room building that smelled of dust and coal. The old records clerk, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like dried paper, helped him pull the county archives from a back shelf. It didn't take long to find the name. Ezra Hartley, born 1883, declared deceased in 1933. The cause of death was left blank. The clerk frowned at that, running a finger down the page. "Strange thing," she said. "Whole family filed it themselves. No doctor's signature. No burial certificate either." Thomas stared at the page, a chill creeping through his hands. "You think he's really dead?" he asked before realizing how foolish the question sounded. The woman gave him a look that wasn't quite an answer. "Depends on what you mean by dead," she said softly, then closed the ledger with a snap. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening beneath the weak glow of a street lamp. Thomas lit a cigarette, his fingers trembling slightly. He couldn't shake the image of the Hartleys standing in that fog, silent and stiff, their eyes never meeting his. The thought of Ezra, husband, father, rumored tyrant, standing among them like a phantom made the whole day feel unreal. Still, part of him refused to accept the supernatural explanation. There had to be logic somewhere, a trick of light, a double exposure, an elaborate local tale designed to scare outsiders. Yet when he returned to his room, the photograph lay where he had left it, though he could have sworn he'd turned it face down. It was upright now, propped against the lamp, the blurred hand clearer than ever. In the reflection of the glass, he thought he saw movement behind his own shoulder, a faint shape, gone when he turned, but leaving behind a feeling he could no longer reason away. The morning after he uncovered the truth about Ezra Hartley, Thomas woke to an eerie stillness. The usual sounds of the town, the distant bark of dogs, the creak of wagons, the faint hum of voices, had vanished. Even the air felt heavier, as though the world were holding its breath. He rose from his bed, drawn again to the photograph on the table. The image looked darker than before, its tones richer, as if the shadows themselves had deepened overnight. Something about the way the family stood now seemed off-kilter. The youngest child's eyes, once dull and vacant, appeared wider, more aware. He blinked hard, certain fatigue was playing tricks on him. Yet when he looked again, her gaze still seemed to follow him. Uneasy, he tucked the photograph into its sleeve and packed his things. He needed distance, needed to see the Hartleys once more to quiet the storm of doubt in his mind. The road back to the hollow was slick with mud and silence. The fog had returned, thicker this time, swallowing the horizon until it was impossible to tell where the sky ended and the earth began. His car struggled up the hill, tires slipping on wet clay, until the forest finally gave way to the clearing where the Hartley house stood. Only now, it looked different, emptier, quieter, as though the life had drained out of it. No smoke rose from the chimney. No figures lingered near the porch. Even the birds avoided the trees nearby. Thomas climbed out of the car, calling out their name, his voice cracking through the thick air. No reply came, only the echo of his own words tumbling back from the hills. He approached the front door, which hung slightly open, the wood swollen from rain. Inside, the air was sour, heavy with a smell that clung to his throat. The furniture was overturned, dishes scattered across the floor, and yet there was no sign of struggle, only abandonment. On the wall, above the empty hearth, hung something that made his chest tighten. It was another photograph, framed in cheap wood, but this one was his. The same picture he had taken days earlier, nailed there as if in reverence. He stepped closer and saw a faint brown smear across its surface, blood, dry and cracking under the light that filtered through the boarded windows. Behind him, the floorboards creaked, though he stood perfectly still. The silence that followed was complete, suffocating, until he realized with cold certainty that the house wasn't empty at all. Somewhere in the dark, something was still there, watching him breathe. Thomas's breath caught as his eyes adjusted to the dim light inside the Hartley house. The walls were stained with years of neglect, the air thick with the stench of rot and damp earth. Each step he took stirred the dust into faint spirals that seemed to move on their own. He called out again, softer this time, the sound almost apologetic. Still, no answer. The silence pressed harder, and he began to notice the smallest details, the half-eaten meal on the table, the cracked cup filled with rainwater, a chair tipped over as though someone had risen in haste. But it was the bedrooms upstairs that drew him most, their doors all slightly ajar as if waiting to be opened. His hand trembled as he reached for the first one, pushing it open just enough to let in a sliver of grey light. Inside, the room was cold and still. On the narrow bed lay a woman, her eyes open, her skin pale as parchment. At first he thought she was sleeping, until he saw the way her mouth hung open, her lips blue and dry. She was perfectly still, her hands folded neatly over her chest. Thomas stumbled back, his heart hammering as he moved toward the next room. One by one, he found them, each of the Hartleys lying in their own beds, their faces frozen in the same expression of terror. There were no wounds, no blood, nothing to explain how life had left them. Yet their eyes, wide and glassy, told of something seen in those final moments, something that had come for them in silence. He wanted to flee, to run back into the fog and pretend none of it had happened, but something made him stop. At the end of the hallway, the final door stood open. Inside, nailed to the wall above the last bed, hung the photograph, the same one he had taken, now warped and wet from the moisture that bled through the walls. It glistened under the thin light, the figure in the background clearer than ever. The shadow's face, once blurred, now bore faint features, sunken eyes, a grim curve of a mouth, and a resemblance that struck him like ice. It was Ezra. The hand that had rested on the daughter's shoulder now seemed to grip her entirely, the fingers sharper, almost claw-like. The more he stared, the more he felt the same pressure on his own shoulder, a cold, heavy weight that made his knees weaken. The camera slipped from his grasp and shattered against the floor, the sound echoing through the dead house. For the first time, Thomas understood why no one ever returned to the Hartleys after dark. In the days that followed his discovery at the Hartley house, Thomas could not escape the image burned into his mind. He had reported what he saw to the sheriff, though he left out the details about the photograph. The authorities made the trip to the hollow a day later, but when they returned, their report was brief and strangely dismissive. They claimed the family had died of carbon monoxide poisoning from a broken stove, an explanation so convenient it almost sounded rehearsed. Yet when Thomas asked whether they had seen the photograph hanging on the wall, their expressions shifted. One officer, older and tired, muttered that there was nothing worth mentioning inside that house and that he should let the matter rest. But Thomas knew they were lying. He had seen the way their hands trembled as they lit their cigarettes, the way they refused to meet his eyes. Something inside that house had unsettled even them. Back in his rented room, the air felt wrong. His belongings were just as he'd left them, yet there was a heaviness that hadn't been there before. He lit the lamp, and that's when he saw it, the photograph. It was lying on the floor by his bed, though he was certain he had left it at the house. The glass was cracked across the center, splitting the image down the middle. For a long moment he stared, unable to breathe. The figure of Ezra had changed again. He was no longer standing in the doorway. Now he stood closer, nearly filling the frame, his eyes faintly visible through the grain of the print. And worse, the background had shifted. Where the Hartley house once stood, there was now only darkness, and in that darkness, a faint outline of a seventh figure, someone he recognized. It was him. His own face, faint and indistinct, watching from behind the others. Sleep became impossible after that. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains made him flinch. He began to see movement in the corners of the room, shapes that faded when he turned his head. Once, while shaving, he caught a glimpse of someone standing behind him in the mirror, a man whose features were too blurred to identify. The straight razor slipped from his hand, slicing a shallow line across his neck. Blood trickled down, and he swore he felt a cold hand brush it away. The photograph still lay on the table where he had dropped it, its surface faintly glistening in the light. Each time he looked at it, the shadows seemed to shift, as though waiting for him to understand that what had haunted the Hartleys had now found him too. Thomas's health began to unravel in the weeks after the Hartley discovery. His skin grew pale, his eyes sunken, and his once steady hands trembled whenever he tried to hold a camera. He stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and spent long nights staring at the photograph that refused to die. No matter how many times he tried to destroy it, burning it, tearing it, even burying it in the woods, it always found its way back. Once, he woke to find it resting on his chest, the glass cold against his skin. The image seemed to change each night, the figures shifting ever so slightly as if alive in their frozen world. Ezra's face had become sharper now, and behind him, the faint shape of Thomas himself had grown clearer, his expression eerily identical to the dead man's. He began to believe the photograph wasn't capturing moments in time, it was claiming them. He wrote frantic letters to colleagues up north, begging them to take the negative, to study it, to keep it far from him. Only one answered, a friend named Walter, who promised to receive the parcel without opening it. Thomas wrapped the photograph and its glass plate in cloth and sealed it in a wooden box, scrawling a note across the top that read, *, never look too closely at what the dead want remembered. *. The next morning, he brought it to the post office, his hands shaking so violently that the clerk asked if he was ill. He lied, said he'd caught the flu, and left without meeting her eyes. That night, he felt a presence in the room again, heavier than before. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth. His breath came out in short, visible bursts, and from somewhere behind him came the faint crack of floorboards bending beneath weight. He turned, but there was nothing there, only the photograph, sitting once more on the table, though he had mailed it hours earlier. By morning, the hotel manager found the room empty, the bed undisturbed, and the lamp still burning. Only one thing remained on the table, The same photograph, its surface now darker, almost wet-looking, with 7 figures standing in the frame instead of 6. The 7th was unmistakably Thomas. His colleague Walter received the package 3 days later. Inside was only the negative and the note, no photograph, no explanation, only the lingering chill that seemed to seep through the envelope itself. The police later listed Thomas Keane as missing, presumed dead, though no one ever found his body. But the photograph, the one that had ended 7 lives, continued to resurface in archives and private collections, its shadows deepening with every retelling, as though it was still waiting for someone new to look too closely.